I still remember the moment it happened, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was quiet and it hurt in a way I had never felt before. We were sitting in the living room that evening. The light was soft. The house was clean, the way I always kept it. My husband was talking on the phone, his voice calm and proud. I wasn't trying to listen, but when you live with someone for 20 years, their words find you even when you're not looking for them. He laughed gently and said, "I built all of this on my own." I froze where I stood. Not because I wanted to confront him, not because I felt angry, but because something inside me suddenly felt very small and very tired. I stood there, holding a folded dish towel in my hands, listening to him speak about his success, about his hard work, about how far he had come. And in that moment, I realized he hadn't mentioned me even once. Not as a partner, not as support, not as the woman who carried the weight when he couldn't. I didn't cry. I didn't interrupt the call. I just stood there, breathing slowly, feeling a quiet truth settle into my heart. After 20 years of marriage, my husband had forgotten who carried us. That night, when he hung up the phone, he smiled at me like everything was normal, like nothing had changed. And maybe for him, nothing had. But for me, something had shifted. Something I could not put back the way it was. I went to the kitchen and sat at the table alone. The same table where we had eaten countless meals, where our children once did homework, where I had paid bills, planned meals, and waited through long evenings. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I remember thinking, how did we get here? How did 20 years turn into this moment where my life felt invisible? That night, sleep did not come easily. My husband lay beside me, breathing steadily, already at peace. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the house, my thoughts drifting back through the years. Back to when everything began. We were young when we married. Not careless young, but hopeful. We didn't have much money. We didn't have a big plan. What we had was trust. Or at least I believed we did. He had dreams back then. Big ones. A better job. A better life. Stability. I believed in him so fully that I didn't question what it might cost me. I told myself that love meant sacrifice. That marriage meant teamwork. That sometimes one person carries more so the other can grow. And so I carried. I carried the home. I carried the children. I carried the quiet worries he never had to think about. When money was tight, I found ways to stretch it. When he came home tired, I stayed strong. When his confidence wavered, I became the steady one. I never thought to keep score. I never imagined I would need proof. Because back then, I believed that being seen would come naturally. Our home was never fancy, but it was warm. I made sure of that. I learned his habits, his moods, his silences. I knew when to speak and when to let things pass. I thought that understanding was love. Years passed like that. Quietly. Slowly. One season blending into the next. There were moments of happiness, of course. Laughter. Family gatherings. Small celebrations. But underneath it all, I was always adjusting. Always stepping back, so he could step forward. I told myself it was temporary. That one day, when things settled, he would notice. That one day, he would look back and see what we had built together. But life has a way of moving forward without looking back. And somewhere along the way, my sacrifices became invisible. Not because they didn't matter, but because they were always there. Like air. Like silence. Like me. As I lay there that night, I realized something painful and clear. Love doesn't disappear all at once. It fades in small moments. In words not said. In names not mentioned. In stories told without you in them. That was the night I understood I had been carrying more than just a family. I had been carrying a marriage, alone. And this is the story of how I came to see it. The morning after that night felt the same as every other morning. The sun came in through the kitchen window. The coffee pot hummed softly. My husband read the paper like he always did. If someone had walked into our home, they would have seen a peaceful marriage. But inside me, something had changed. I moved through the day slowly, more aware than before. I noticed how often I adjusted my plans around his needs, how easily my own wants disappeared before they ever became words. These were things I had lived with for years, but now they felt heavier. As I washed the dishes, I remembered the early days, when we were just starting out, when he worked long hours and came home exhausted. I used to wait up for him, even when I was tired. I would warm his dinner, listen to his worries, and tell him everything would be okay. "You're doing great," I would say. "We'll get through this." He rarely asked how I was doing, not because he was cruel, but because I never gave him a reason to ask. I had learned early on to be the strong one, the steady one, the one who didn't complain. Over time, that strength became expected. When the children were born, my world became even smaller. I left my job to stay home with them. It wasn't a decision we discussed for long. It just felt like what needed to be done. His work was important. My work was flexible. Days blended together. Feedings, laundry, school lunches, doctor visits. I carried the emotional weight of the family quietly, making sure everyone else felt secure. My husband's career grew, slowly at first, then faster. New responsibilities, new confidence, new stories to tell at dinner. I listened carefully, proud of him, happy to see him succeed, but as his world expanded, mine stayed the same. There were small moments that began to sting. Little things, the kind that seem harmless on their own. At family gatherings, he would talk about his achievements, his long hours, his sacrifices. People would nod and praise him. I would stand nearby, smiling politely, refilling drinks, clearing plates. No one asked how I managed the home alone during his late nights. No one asked how I kept everything running smoothly. And he never mentioned it either. Once, an old friend said to him, "You've worked so hard to get where you are." He smiled and said, "Yes, I have." I waited for him to add something, anything, but he didn't. That night, I lay awake again, staring into the darkness. I wondered if he truly believed he had done it all alone, or if he simply didn't think my part was worth saying out loud. I tried to speak up once. Just once. We were sitting together after dinner. The house was quiet. I told him I was feeling tired. Not physically, but deep inside. He nodded and said, "You should rest more." That was it. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what I needed. And I didn't push. I swallowed my words the way I always did. Because after years of being quiet, speaking up felt unnatural. Almost wrong. As time passed, I began to notice how often my presence faded into the background. Decisions were made without asking me. Plans were formed assuming I would adjust. My life bent around his without question. When he succeeded, it was his success. When something went wrong at home, it was just part of life. There were days I felt invisible even sitting right beside him. I started to feel like a shadow in my own marriage. Always there. Always supportive. Rarely acknowledged. Sometimes I caught myself wondering who I might have been if I had chosen differently. If I had held on to my dreams instead of setting them aside. But those thoughts felt selfish, so I pushed them away. A good wife doesn't think like that, I told myself. A good wife supports. But support without recognition slowly turns into silence. And silence has a way of growing loud inside your heart. The more successful he became, the smaller I felt. Not because I envied him, but because I no longer recognized myself. One evening, while folding laundry, I found an old notebook. Inside were ideas I once had, small dreams, things I wanted to try. I sat on the bed and read them quietly. I barely remembered writing them. That's when I realized the truth I had been avoiding. I hadn't just given up my time or my energy. I had given up parts of myself. And no one, not even my husband, seemed to notice they were gone. The tension between us wasn't loud. There were no arguments, no raised voices, just a growing distance filled with unspoken words. I kept hoping he would see me again, that one day he would look at me and say, "I couldn't have done this without you." But hope, when it waits too long, turns into something else. And I could feel that something building inside me, quietly. The moment that changed everything did not come during an argument. It didn't happen during a crisis. It came on an ordinary day, in an ordinary room, with words spoken so casually they cut deeper than anger ever could. We were at a small gathering. Just a few people. Friends and family sitting together, sharing food and stories. The kind of evening that feels safe.
Familiar.
Comfortable. My husband was in a good mood. Relaxed. Confident. He had reached a place in his career where people listened when he spoke. And that night they were listening closely. Someone asked him how he managed to build such a stable life. How he stayed focused. How he made it all work. He smiled and leaned back in his chair. I sacrificed a lot, he said. I worked hard. I stayed focused. I didn't let anything distract me. Everyone nodded. Someone clapped softly. Another person said how impressive it was. I sat right there beside him, waiting. Waiting for him to say we. Waiting for him to say my wife. Waiting for him to look at me. He didn't. Instead, he added something that finally broke through the quiet wall I had built around my heart. I did this alone, he said. No one carried me. The room stayed warm and friendly. People smiled. The conversation moved on. But inside me, something cracked. I felt it in my chest first. A slow, heavy ache. Then a tightness in my throat. I kept my face calm. I had learned how to do that well. I nodded slightly, as if I agreed. But the truth was, those words erased 20 years in a single sentence. All the nights I stayed awake worrying about money. All the times I put my needs aside. All the quiet strength I carried so he could move forward.
Gone.
I excused myself and went into the kitchen. The sound of laughter faded behind me. I stood by the sink and stared out the window. It had started to rain lightly, the drops sliding down the glass in slow lines. I thought, if I disappeared right now, would anyone notice what was missing? When I returned to the room, he was laughing again, telling another story. I sat down quietly and listened, my hands folded in my lap. On the drive home, the car was silent. The streetlights passed one by one. My heart felt full, but not in a good way. Full of things unsaid. Finally, I spoke. Do you really believe you did everything alone? I asked softly. He glanced at me, surprised.
What do you mean? He said.
I took a breath. My voice was steady, but my hands trembled slightly. I mean, the life we built. The years. The sacrifices. Do you really think you carried it all by yourself? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that hurt almost as much as the words from earlier. Well, I worked hard, he said. I don't think about it the way you do. That was it.
No anger. No apology.
No understanding. Just a distance between us that suddenly felt very clear. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after. He went to bed. The house was quiet again. The clock ticked softly on the wall. I felt like I was finally seeing my marriage clearly for the first time. Not as something broken, but as something unbalanced. I had spent years carrying weight without asking to be seen. And he had spent years walking forward without looking back. The realization didn't make me cry right away. It made me still, calm in a way that felt unfamiliar. Like I had reached the end of a long road and finally stopped walking. I wasn't angry with him. I was sad for myself. Sad that I had waited so long to matter. Sad that I had believed silence was strength. Sad that love, for me, had meant disappearing quietly. That night, something shifted inside me. Not loudly. Not dramatically.
But deeply.
I understood then that being forgotten doesn't happen because you weren't important. Sometimes it happens because you gave too much without asking to be remembered. And once you see that truth, you can never unsee it. That was the moment everything began to change, that I still remember the night everything changed. Not because there was shouting, not because there was drama, but because of how quiet it was. The house felt heavier that evening. Even the walls seemed tired. The clock in the living room ticked louder than usual, as if it wanted to remind me that time had been passing, and I had not noticed how alone I had become. My husband came home late. later than usual. I was sitting at the dining table, folding old napkins. I did not know why I was folding them. Maybe I just wanted my hands to feel useful. He did not say hello. He loosened his tie, placed his phone on the table, and sat down without looking at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I waited, like I always did. Then he sighed. A deep sigh. The kind that sounds tired, but also annoyed. He finally looked at me and said, "We need to talk." Those words used to scare me when we were young. That night, they felt empty. I nodded slowly. Okay, I
said.
He rubbed his forehead, as if searching for the right words. And then he said something I never expected to hear after 20 years of marriage. "I feel like I've been carrying everything alone." I blinked. I thought I had heard him wrong. Alone, I repeated softly. He nodded.
Yes.
The responsibilities, the stress, the pressure. Sometimes it feels like you don't understand how hard it has been for me. My chest tightened. Not with anger, with disbelief. I wanted to speak. I wanted to remind him of the nights I stayed awake worrying about bills. The meals I skipped so the children could eat more. The dreams I quietly folded away like old clothes. But I stayed silent. He continued, his voice calm, almost casual. "You used to be stronger, more supportive. Now, I don't know. You've changed." Changed. That word sat between us like a broken plate. I looked at my hands. They were not soft anymore. They were rough, lined with years of work, cooking, cleaning, holding, giving. I asked quietly, "In what way have I changed?" He shrugged. "You don't inspire me like before. You don't bring peace anymore."
Peace.
I almost smiled, because I realized something in that moment. I had been giving peace for so long that I forgot to keep any for myself. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen. Not to run away, but to breathe. The kettle was still warm. I poured myself a cup of water, my hands shaking just a little. Behind me, he said, "See? This is what I mean. You walk away instead of listening." I turned around. "I am listening," I said calmly. "I've been listening for 20 years. He looked surprised, as if it was the first time he heard my voice. I walked back and sat down. "Do you remember?" I asked gently. "The year your business failed?" He frowned. "Yes, do you remember who sold her gold bangles to help you start again?" He looked away. "Do you remember the nights you slept peacefully while I cried quietly so the children wouldn't hear?" Still silence. I leaned forward slightly. "You say you carried everything alone, but you forgot who was holding you while you carried it."
His face changed then.
Not anger, not guilt, confusion, as if he had never thought about it that way. But instead of apologizing, instead of understanding, he said something that broke something inside me. "Well, that's what wives do." That sentence was the turning point. Not loud, not cruel, just careless. Something in me went quiet. Not my heart. My hope. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "That is what wives do." I stood up again. This time, I did not feel weak. I felt tired. "I'm going to bed," I said. That night, I lay awake beside him. His back turned toward me. The ceiling fan spun slowly above us, round and round, like my thoughts. I realized then that he had not forgotten my sacrifices. He had normalized them, and that realization hurt more than any argument ever could. In the darkness, I whispered to myself. After 20 years of marriage, he forgot who carried us. And for the first time in my life, I wondered what would happen if I stopped carrying everything. The days after that night felt different. Not louder, not dramatic, just different. The house was the same. The walls, the furniture, the family photos hanging slightly crooked on the wall. But something inside me had shifted. I still woke up early. I still made tea. I still swept the floor and folded clothes. But I was no longer doing it to be seen. I was doing it because it was part of me, not because it was expected. My husband noticed the change before he understood it. I spoke less, not out of anger, but because I was finally listening to myself. I no longer rushed to ask if he had eaten. I no longer reminded him of small things. I stopped fixing problems before they became visible. Not to punish him, just to breathe. One evening, he sat across from me at the dining table. The same table where so many meals had been shared.
The
same table where I had swallowed so many words. He looked at me and asked, "Are you upset with me?" I shook my head slowly.
No.
That answer confused him more than anger ever could. "Then why do you feel so distant?" he asked. I thought for a moment. I chose my words carefully. "I'm not distant," I said softly. "I'm just not invisible anymore." He frowned, as if trying to understand a language he had never learned. That night, I went into the spare room and opened an old box. Inside were memories I had packed away years ago. Old letters, photos from before marriage, a small notebook where I once wrote my dreams. I sat on the bed and turned the pages slowly. I remembered the woman I used to be, the one who laughed loudly, the one who believed love meant partnership, not endurance. Tears fell quietly, not from pain, but from recognition. I had lost myself trying to keep everyone else whole. The next morning, I did something small but powerful. I went for a walk alone. No phone.
No errands.
No purpose. Just me and the quiet road. The sky was soft that morning. The air smelled clean. For the first time in years, I felt present in my own life. When I returned home, my husband was waiting. "You didn't tell me you were going out," he said. I smiled gently. I didn't know I needed permission. He didn't respond, but something in his eyes shifted. That evening, he asked me to sit with him. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said." I stayed silent. "I never meant to make you feel unimportant," he continued. "I just got used to you always being there." I nodded. "That's what scared me," I replied. "Being taken for granted feels like disappearing." He looked down at his hands, the same hands I had held through so many storms. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly. I looked at him, really looked at him. "I don't want to lose myself," I answered. That was the moment something honest finally entered the room. Not romance. Not apology.
Truth.
We didn't fix everything that night. We didn't suddenly become a perfect couple. But something changed. He began to notice. The way I sat quietly when I was tired. The way I paused before answering. The way I chose myself in small ways. And I began to heal. Not because he changed, but because I did. I learned that love should not erase you. That sacrifice should not cost your identity. That being strong does not mean being silent forever. One afternoon, he brought me tea.
Set it down gently. "Thank you," he said.
"For everything you've done." It wasn't enough to erase the past. But it was a beginning. I held the warm cup and felt something new. Not victory. Not revenge.
Peace.
Because I finally understood something important. I was never weak. I was generous. And generosity deserves respect. Now, when I look back on those 20 years, I don't see them as wasted. I see them as chapters. Some were heavy. Some were beautiful. All of them shaped me. I no longer measure my life by how much I gave. I measure it by how much of myself I kept. There was a time when I believed love meant losing yourself for someone else. That if you carried the weight quietly, it meant you were strong. But strength is not silence. And love is not forgetting who you are. I learned that people can forget your sacrifices when you make them look easy. They can forget your pain when you hide it behind a smile. Not because they are cruel, but because you taught them it was normal. If I could speak to the woman I used to be, I would hold her hands and say this: "You are allowed to take up space.